Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers, students. In continuation of our previous lecture, we will discuss today the poets of early Victorian period. Today we have selected Robert Browning in our discussion. Yesterday we threw some light on Alfred Tennyson. The purpose of our today's lecture is to throw light over the two poets Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson, and their contributions shall be revealed, and their distinguishing traits will also be discussed. Let's start our lecture. In the yesterday's lecture we had discussed that Alfred Tennyson was the poet of pessimism. Alfred Tennyson was the poet who gave us a pessimistic and weak ideas. Today we find that there was a difference between Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson. At first I'll start my lecture with the introduction of Robert Browning. Robert Browning, as you see here, that he was born in 1812. He was actually the peer of Alfred Tennyson, who was born, I guess you would remember, in 1809. Both belonged to the same era, but the tendencies both had adopted were quite different. You may say that they were antithetical. Robert Browning, who was also born in the same era, received little respect when we see Alfred Tennyson in receiving ovation from his fellows, from his critics, from the readers. It was perhaps the reason that the Robert Browning, who has selected a subject which was not quite in vogue in England, which was supposed to be ugly, not comely. So at first the critics didn't give much attention to Robert Browning's poetry. Tennyson's poetry gave the poetry much beauty, elegance and daintiness, and that was why we find Tennyson's poetry received a lot of readers and critics' commendation, critics' applause, and we find Alfred Tennyson growing in terms of receiving readership. And in the beginning, Robert Browning could not receive much favor from the critics. But this man continued with his writings, continues with his subjects, continued with the style he had chosen. And after some years, the critics found out the depth in the writings in the poetry of Robert Browning. That was why we found later that Robert Browning was then considered to be superior to Alfred Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson, who was supposed to be superior to Robert Browning, now the direction now changed. How it is changed? Robert Browning became superior in terms of writing poetry. Let's discuss. Number one, poetry of Robert Browning stresses upon individual will. He does not surrenders individual will over common collective good, over obstacles. And if we go to Alfred Tennyson, we find his poetry reflects issues in England, and those issues that were prevalent in England at that time had been discussed, and he supports subordinating the individual will over collective good. We find that the individual will in his poetry has been subordinated. You would have remembered that a lot of issues had been raised in the then England. The issue of Crimean War, in which though in the end England was the victor, and the other Russia and other allies were on the defeat side. Though this was the issue, and another issue, that it was the issue of women's higher education, all these issues. And another issue, there was a conflict between materialism and the religious norms, which were in conflict with each other. So these issues have been raised in Alfred Tennyson's poetry, and in these issues he strongly subordinates, surrenders individual will. So in this respect, Robert Browning, the tendencies of Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson are quite different. Now coming to the second characteristic, we find that in the writings of Robert Browning, his poetry shows optimistic and strong leanings, optimistic leanings, in which a person gains strength. And on the other hand, when we read the poetry of Alfred Tennyson, it is pessimistic, it is frustrating, it is weak, it makes the reader weak. So here again we find a distinguishing trait of Robert Browning, quite different from Alfred Tennyson. Moving on to the next trait, we find that the poetry of Robert Browning that he had made is dramatic. And this very characteristic made him prominent in his era and the coming era also. And when we read the poetry of Alfred Tennyson, it is mainly lyrical. So here is a wide gap between the poetic trends of Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson. So poetry of dramatic leanings gave much applause from critics, received much applause, and poetry which was lyrical in Alfred Tennyson's poetry received little applause from the critics. Next, when we come to the next characteristic, poetry discovers truth lies hidden in both evil and good. According to Robert Browning's own philosophy of life, he says that truth can be found even in evil, even in good, and poetry is the source of discovering that truth. And when we come to the poetry of Alfred Tennyson, we find that his poetry offers solution to the problems in which England was trapped at that time. So here there is a compendium of the differences between Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning, and here is some of the sketches. Here is some of the sketch of Robert Browning's literary contributions that we had written here. He wrote dramatic lyrics. In dramatic lyrics, some of the poems which received a lot of applause are Porphyria's Lover, Fra Lippo, The Last Ride Together, Rabi bin Azra, and My Last Duchess. Let's rectify the spellings. The Last Ride Together. In all these poems, we find the subject is quite mean. Do you know mean? Mean means ugly. Okay? There is no comeliness, there is no beauty, there is no elegance we find in this type of poetry. But what is important in his poetry is truthfulness. For example, when we see Porphyria's Lover, we find that Porphyria is a girl who is married to someone, but she is in love with a person outside her marital status. She ditches her husband and goes to her lover, who was quite doubtful about her loyalty, about her fidelity, strangles Porphyria to death with the pretext that in this way she would be his. She would be his. She would not dare to leave her. She would not to be disloyal to her. So with this pretext, and Porphyria was murdered, and we find here that Robert Browning shows a dramatic lyric in with a new subject, though that subject was rather an ugly one. And in this way we find Fra Lipolipi. Fra means brother. Lipolipi Lipo is the name of monk who has some love affair with some girl. So that love affair, the monk's love affair with some girl was so much apprehensible. So at that time we find that he was not only highlighting the issues at that time, but also he does not hold himself back in reflecting the ugliness of that time. So Robert Browning, what is important about Robert Browning is his dramatic monologues that makes him important not only in his own era but also in the present one as well. That's why we find his poetry readable. Thank you very much, and I offer all of you, if you find some answers to the question ambiguous, unclear, might write it to me, might send your questions, queries to the chat box so that I may answer to you correctly and satisfactorily. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.